Hi friends, how are we doing today? How is everybody? How are you enjoying your weekend? I've been quite productive today. I've been doing a lot of cleaning because yesterday my roommate cleaned the living room and kitchen area of our apartment. And so today I cleaned the bathroom and I got a new shower liner. Except the only one left at the grocery store was pink. So now we have a pink shower liner living our Barbie best life. And I'm doing laundry right now. So we're feeling very refreshed, spring cleaning vibes. I also had to contact my landlord about some mold growing on our bathroom ceiling. It's like in a straight line about the width of like a pipe. So I feel like there's probably a leak somewhere. This is a relatively new build, so it's not like we have stuff on our ceilings most of the time. So he's gonna come this week, cut a hole in our bathroom ceiling. It's so exciting. I thought today we could read the rest of the introduction to Before We Were Trans by Kit Hayan. I made it through about half of the introduction last time. I'm just gonna finish it up. I do want to put it out there. I will not be reading this entire book on my channel. If you want to read the entire book, please go support the author. I really like their writing style, and this book is fascinating. But I'm not gonna read it on my channel because I don't think I should be giving it out for free. The author doesn't deserve that. They deserve to get, money and support for their book. But yeah, if you missed the first video, that is the first half of the introduction, I will link it in my description. Definitely recommend watching that one first. So let's get started. Okay, I am trying to find where I stopped, and I think I'm gonna go back one paragraph, so there will be one repeated paragraph, and then we'll get to the new stuff, okay? I'm just like not incredibly sure where I stopped because it's not like there was a specific spot. Like this is just in the middle of the introduction. So something in my mouth. Alright. Often what this means is that our narratives of trans history are recent, avoiding challenges of terminology or evidence, binary, including only those trans people whose identities are male or female, stereotyped, limited to those who live and present in a way that conforms to contemporary social expectations about that gender identity, and medicalized, restricted to those who have accessed medical transition whenever possible. And perhaps most damagingly, it also often means that our trans histories are white. In fact, our contemporary idea of what it means to be trans has itself been shaped by those well-known trans people like Christine Jorgensen, who were able to conform to the ideals of white femininity or masculinity. More broadly, the impact of colonialist ideology on the way white historians write about history, and the impact of racism on whose history books get read, has led to a widespread failure to acknowledge the histories of people of color whose experience of gender can't be contained within a modern Western binary. Thinking about gender critically and expansively is a central and necessary part of any anti-racist project. This point isn't just relevant to history. Challenging Western constructs of gender in the present day is essential to challenging racism. To deny the reality of any genders beyond male and female is also to deny the reality of many genders that white people in Western Europe and the USA aren't socialized to recognize, many of whose histories I tell in this book. Importantly, while white non-binary people might feel a sense of kinship or recognition with these genders, they're not the same as being non-binary or trans in a Western sense. White non-binary people often seize upon the existence of these genders to prove the validity of our own, tokenizing, instrumentalizing, and romanticizing them often without really taking the time to understand them on their own terms. This is a problem when white people use the genders of people of color in this way. It recapitulates a colonialist dynamic of exploitation. The desire to name and categorize people according to Western metrics reflects and reenacts a similar colonialist impulse. I've tried hard to avoid this dynamic when writing this book. It's why, as you'll see, I've continually emphasized the cultural specificity of gender and the way we can't separate it out from factors like sexuality, spirituality, and fashion, which work together to make gender what it is. It's also why I've continually emphasized the violent impact of Western colonialism on many of the people whose histories I am telling here. Black feminists like Kimberly Crenshaw, Audre Lorde, Bell Hooks, B. Kaminga, Emi Koyama, and many others have long emphasized that the way we experience and understand gender is inextricable from race. In its simplest terms, this is one of the points that the anti-slavery activist Sojourner Truth made as long ago as 1851, emphasizing that white women were treated as if they needed to be helped into carriages and lifted over ditches and have the best place everywhere. But nobody ever helps me into carriages or over mud puddles or gives me any best place, and ain't I a woman? Relatedly, many trans people of color whose genders aren't binary have emphasized that their experience of gender is inextricable from their cultures. As Carrier First Nations two-spirited researcher Michelle Cameron has described, the intertribal term two-spirit, used by Native American First Nations people to describe a variety of culturally specific gendered experiences that are neither male nor female, is a reclaimed term designed by Aboriginals to define our unique cultural context, histories, and legacy. And as I've mentioned earlier, the trans people whose genders are taken most seriously and whose construction of their trans identities have come to define the terms in which others could articulate on their own, have tended to be those who can perform the norms of white femininity or white masculinity most effectively. This means that, even among trans people who do fit comfortably into the classical narrative of male-female identity and medical transition, trans people of color remain marginalized and must struggle harder to have their genders respected and validated. When combined with the systemic racism and misogyny, this means that trans women of color, especially black trans women, are at a devastatingly high risk of violence. In 1977, the Combahee River Collective of Black lesbians issued a statement critiquing the way white feminism privileged gender, often understood as essentialized in a way that excluded trans women as the most fundamental axis of oppression around which political organizing should take place. We know, they asserted, that there is such thing as racial sexual oppression, which is neither solely racial nor solely sexual. Similar ideas have been expressed by queer indigenous writers. As Cameron explains, the term two-spirit/two-spirited was chosen to emphasize our difference in our experiences of multiple interlocking oppressions as queer Aboriginal people. The collective's work paved the way for Kimberly Crenshaw's later articulation of the concept of intersectionality, and it has also been a key driving force behind the opposition of black feminists to the trans exclusionary factions of white feminism. As Emi Koyama has put it succinctly, to argue that trans women should be excluded from women's spaces because their experiences are different would have to assume that all other women's experiences are the same, and this is a racist assumption. To fail to consider race as one factor that co-constitutes gender, then, is to homogenize people of all genders, erasing both the experiences of people of color and their intellectual and activist contributions, most importantly, those of black feminism. This has important implications for how we think about trans history. Many cultures throughout history, including those I've mentioned above, have had genders that aren't male or female because they're inherently spiritual, because they're linked to sexuality, or because they're partly about a person's social role. Contemporary Western ideas would tell us that these genders are less real than others, or too complicated to fit under a trans umbrella. This book is full of genders like this. To ignore them is to prop up the racist idea that having genders that aren't male or female, or approaching gender disruptively and creatively, is something only modern people and or white people do. Stories of trans history can also support our anti-racist work in the present day because they reveal the racist origins of our contemporary ideas about sex and gender. In particular, the idea that sex is dimorphic, that there are two types of sexed body, and that they are clearly delineated, has a racist history. As 19th century scientists developed racist taxonomies of human beings, grouping people into the racial categories we've inherited today, they also developed theories about sexual dimorphism. For these scientists, sexual dimorphism was one of the things that divided people into different races. White people's bodies were the most perfectly divided into male and female, while people of color had fewer differences between the sexes. We can see the legacy of these racist ideas everywhere today. They're behind the association of black women with masculine-coded anger and the feminization of Asian men. Knowing the history of our contemporary ideas about sexual dimorphism can help us both to challenge these racist ideologies and to dismantle transphobic arguments that there are only two genders, or that our ideas about sex are based on neutral biology. In the process of researching this book, I've wrestled a lot with the question of what exactly makes me, a white writer, using the stories of people of color different from the colonizers whose actions I'm condemning here. One way I've tried to address this is by making visible the many forms of racism that led to these stories being insufficiently known in the first place. Another is by emphasizing that trans liberation and anti-racism are inextricable struggles, and commitment to the former must necessitate commitment to the latter. In the words of Leslie Feinberg, who showed that trans history can pave the way for the liberation of all marginalized people in a manifesto I can only hope to emulate here, we should aspire to be the best fighters against each other's oppression, and in doing so, build the links of solidarity and trust that will forge an invincible movement against all forms of injustice and equality. Another is by doing my best to platform the voices of trans people of color working within and outside the discipline of history. I hope people will read the notes and take my reading recommendations seriously. Not everyone will think this is enough. I'm not sure I think it is myself. But right now, one flawed step toward making these histories resonate more loudly, along with the anti-racist politics they demand, feels cautiously like a step worth taking. This right now feels like the best way of using the platform I've been given. To paraphrase the non-binary storyteller Ivan Coyote, it's still so rare for trans people to get the microphone that, when we do, it's often difficult to shake the feeling that we're being handed it on behalf of every trans person alive. I hope fervently that I won't be the last trans person to give the opportunity to talk about what our history can be, and I hope this book might play a part in creating the conditions where that's more likely and more possible. How did we end up with historical narratives that represent such a narrow slice of trans life? How did we reach a point where so many of our trans histories erase people's experiences of gender hasn't been binary or stereotyped, who haven't transitioned medically, and or whose gender can't be accurately described in modern Western terms? One of the reasons is that historical methodology, the way we're accustomed to doing and thinking about history academically, tends to demand a much higher standard of evidence to prove that someone in the past can be called trans than it does to prove that they can be called cis. Because trans people are a minority, we're seen as an aberration from the norm. Our society treats cisgenderness as the default or unmarked state of all human beings. This is compounded for anyone whose body is seen as non-normative. In white Western culture, this includes not only trans people, but also intersex people, disabled people, and people of color. The pervasive cis-normativity means that the cis perspective is, just like the male perspective, as Simone de Beauvoir argued, positioned as objective truth. This means historians tend to interpret people from the past as, effectively, cis until proven otherwise. Though we might not admit it, or even realize it consciously, this approach also enables historians to avoid the horror of, accidentally mislabeling a straight, cis person from the past as queer. And if, as a result, we mislabel queer trans person as straight or cis, well, funnily enough, that doesn't cause much anxiety. Our sense of what we need to be cautious about has been insidiously shaped by homophobia and transphobia. Relatedly, trans people who write about our own history are, like many other marginalized groups, often accused of bias. To anyone who accuses me of rereading the past from a perspective bias toward finding trans history, I would say you're absolutely right, but I would also say that I am no less objective than any other historian, because we live in a society that sees cis people as the default, the the majority of these histories are biased against finding trans history, even when they try not to be. But funnily enough, it tends to only be marginalized groups who are accused of lacking objectivity. While I'm keen not to constrain the possibilities of the past by fixing historical people in modern categories, I'm equally keen for us to remember that cis man and cis woman are modern categories as well. Making space for trans possibility then is no less objective than any other kinds of history. In fact, in many cases, it might be more so. Objectivity aside, though, I also want to make the case for the value of the trans gaze in historical research. The curator Margaret Middleton and the literary scholar Lindsay Rowe Hayfeld have both argued that we should acknowledge and value the expertise of marginalized people in recognizing people who are like us in the past. As Middleton brilliantly puts it, this means valuing queer experiences as expertise and gaydar as epistemology. Simply put, trans people can pick up on hints and signals in the historical record that others might overlook. This community recognition also provides an ethical alternative to subjecting historical figures to the same kind of diagnostic process that both disabled people and trans people have to go through in the present day to prove our realness. This is a further problem in the way we currently do historical research. In the present day, our structures for validating trans experiences are all built around testimony. Trans people access medical treatment through our testimony, and any attempt to convince the general public to support trans rights includes a personal narrative, a story of what it feels like to be trans that attempts to win sympathy by humanizing us. For the majority of trans writers, the most common genre in which we could get our voices heard is the memoir. The problem with this emphasis, sorry, I don't know why I'm crying. The problem with this emphasis on our testimony is not just that it demands trans people cede our right to privacy, exposing our vulnerabilities in order to prove that we deserve basic human rights. It's that it creates an expectation of testimony. Without testimony, a trans narrative seems incomplete, inconclusive, and invalid. And when we look at historical records and we can't find that testimony, often because we're looking at periods when far fewer people had access to literacy and the means to publish, and many ordinary people's private records of their experience have been lost, we conclude that we can't find any trans people because our standard of evidence hasn't been reached. The other reason that our contemporary narratives of trans history are so limited is that political debates over trans rights and pervasive media transphobia are actually shaping trans people's very sense of our history. On the 27th of November 2017, The Times published an article by Scottish writer and sociologist Stuart Wayton with the headline, "Transgender Fetish is a Truly Shameful Modern Invention." Responding to a moral panic about access to healthcare and gender recognition for young trans people, set against the backdrop of misinformation about the UK government's consultation on reforms of the Gender Recognition Act of 2004, Wayton claimed that trans identities were the endpoint of our culture of narcissism, devoid of external sources of liberation and inspiration. 21st century children and adults have turned to their own bodies as the last available site of experimentation. This was a product of modern society, he argued. The idea that anyone had felt like this in the past was a total fantasy. More than that, the idea of being trans was profoundly conservative. People were being encouraged to transition to fulfill gender stereotypes, to make sure that only girls liked all things pink and frilly, and only boys were into football and fighting. Many contemporary arguments, of which Waitons represents only the tip of the iceberg, focus on the supposed newness of trans identities, were described by columnists as a fad, commentators, and in some cases, psychiatrists, fret that young people are coming out as trans because it's cool. Some anti-trans campaigners have taken these connotations of newness to their logical extreme, denying all possibility of trans history on the basis of our supposed absence from the historical record, and arguing that even to suggest our historical existence is anachronistic. Underlying these claims is a sense that historicity provides legitimacy, that newfangledness of trans identities means policymakers and the general public do not need to, indeed should not, take them seriously. Presenting trans identities as a modern invention also enables transphobic campaigners to frame us as a new and growing threat, something that has come out of nowhere to threaten an existing way of life, and against which women and children, groups positioned, often without their say, as vulnerable victims in this hastily constructed fight, must be protected at all costs. Like other campaigns over LGBTQ+ rights, in which the nebulous but powerful concept of transition is frequently weaponized, the battle for trans rights today is being fought on the battlegrounds of history. It might be expected that this would lead to a resurgence of trans histories, that trans campaigners would fight these arguments by highlighting as many stories from our past as we could, and using those stories to emphasize how diverse and very often non-stereotypical trans people have always been. But the problem, and the root cause, I think, of the narrow historical narratives I described earlier, is that anti-trans campaigners are not simply arguing trans people are new. Instead, they're arguing trans people are new, and that means they're not real. And by coupling our historicity with our realness, they've managed to tap into one of the most profound anxieties of the trans communities today. In January 2015, I screwed up enough courage to attend my local trans group for the first time. The people there were wonderful and welcoming, embracing my new name and pronouns with generosity and kindness. But I was convinced I didn't fit. Every one of them seemed so effortlessly at ease with their trans identities, so secure in their knowledge that this was how they were supposed to be. I knew that not living as female made me happy in a way I hadn't known was possible, but that didn't feel like enough. How do you know this is real? Asked a persistent voice in my head. What if you just think you're trans because it makes you feel special? And what if you've just been talking to too many trans people on the internet? What if you've convinced yourself this is right, but you're wrong? Eventually, I managed to ask the question, did anyone else hear when you first came out? Did you have problems believing yourself? Every single person in the room raised their hand. As trans people, the ways we navigate the world and claim our rights are all oriented around proving our realness, demonstrating that our genders are real and should be treated as such. We have to prove we're real enough to be referred to with the correct pronouns and to be given the medical care we want, to be given legal rights and access to gendered spaces. Our society asks us to reassert our validity again and again. I'm sorry. Anti-trans campaigners claim we're not real, that our genders are constructed and synthetic rather than natural, and that to acknowledge their validity, in particular the femaleness of trans women, is to be asked to participate in a post-truth world or engage in Orwellian doublethink. The experience of me being misgendered chips away at our internal sense of security and the realness of our identities. Even our defenders speak in these terms, implying that asserting our realness is the most effective way to remind people that we deserve human rights. Trans women are real women. Non-binary people are valid. In this context, it's not surprising that we question ourselves, nor is it surprising that we fight our opponents on the terms they've set. When we assert our realness of our identities, we are not just trying to convince anti-trans campaigners that we deserve rights. In many cases, I think we're also trying to reassure ourselves that our genders are real in the face of a world that continually tries to undermine them. And it's never clear what realness really means. But there's a vague, unspoken community consensus over the things that might be considered to trouble it. They're all the messy things that our classical trans narrative prefers to leave out. Fluidity, non-binary identities, play, external motivations, ambiguity. When you're faced with a political landscape that says you're not real, and when you're working in an exhausting, hostile political environment characterized by orchestrated online pylons and immediate Twitter amplification of out-of-context statements, which leaves no room for nuance, the overwhelming temptation is to avoid mentioning these messy aspects of trans experience altogether. To stay on message, which, in Jacob Tobias' words, generally means catering to the least common denominator, watering down your community's story. Make no mistake, clearly, this emphasis on our realness has considerable political value. It helps us to target many of the most pernicious transphobic arguments. It supports the growing consensus that we were born this way, which handily means we can't be morally blamed for being trans or persuaded not to be. And it has personal value too. It feels reassuring, solid, stable. But if we take these contemporary standards of realness anywhere outside our immediate cultural and historical context, they start to crumble. I'm sorry for the yawning. Like I said, guys, I haven't been sleeping super well. This means that when we come to research history, if we bring the standards of realness along with us, we can't get very far at all. One key reason that these standards of realness aren't useful for looking outside our immediate cultural and historical context is because of the way they rely on asserting our deep internal sense of gender. In order to prove our realness, we emphasize how strongly we feel ourselves to be male, female, or non-binary on the inside. We draw a clear distinction between this internal gender identity and external factors like gender expression or gender roles. This internal/external distinction is essential to representing how we understand ourselves, and it's essential to combating arguments like those of Stuart Wayton, which sees trans people as motivated by a desire to conform to gender stereotypes in our external appearance and behavior. But the problem is that this internal/external distinction doesn't really stand up to scrutiny. For one thing, not everyone in the past or in the present understands themselves as having a core, stable, internal self that remains the same at all times. There's a lot of evidence to suggest that this understanding of selfhood is culturally specific, and in Western Europe and the USA, dates back only to the late 18th century. For another, people can have multiple motivations at once. A person in the past who was assigned female at birth and presented male for a term in the army might well be motivated both by a desire to overcome patriarchal assumptions about women's roles and by the affirmation they drew from being seen as male, and might well have struggled to separate the two. I'd challenge anyone today to separate out the internal and external motivations for the way they present themselves. For another, external gender expression can impact or reshape the way we feel inside, whether temporarily or permanently. And for another, even if someone's motivations for disrupting gender are completely external, their history still demonstrates the viability of moving, whether for an hour or a lifetime, away from the gender we were assigned at birth, providing a powerfully liberating precedence for all of us. What can we, as trans people or as historians, do about this? Instead of continuing the exhausting fight to prove our realness in the past and the present, I think it's time we changed the terms of the conversation. If we start to treat our standards of realness critically, we can open up a space for so many more new ways to relate to gender, both in the past and the present. We can both widen the scope of trans history and enable people of every gender to live more freely and expansively. Being really a man, a woman, a non-binary person, or any other gender isn't incompatible with fluidity, situationality, ambiguity, or creativity. And those of us who experience our genders in this way have a longer history than what we might previously have thought possible. Because of this, the way I use the word trans in this book is deliberately expansive. Importantly, expanding trans history isn't the same as rewriting it. While in a sense, everybody who writes a history book is rewriting history, in another sense, it's not possible to rewrite the past. It happened, and nothing can change it. What is possible, and what I want to do here, is to reread the past. Unlike historians a few decades ago, or even a few years ago, we now live in a society that equips us with the tools to realize that gender isn't simple, binary, stable, or inextricably linked to the body. These tools enable us to see in the past that we were always there, but which hasn't been apparent to us until now. What this doesn't mean is reclaiming people from the past as a part of trans history. The language of reclaiming is used a lot, both by trans activists and by anti-trans activists. And every time I see it, I can't help but feel like this capitalist language of ownership is part of the problem, part of the system we're trying to dismantle. As trans historian and literary critic Gabrielle M.W. Bykowski pointed out to me when I brought this up during an online discussion, thinking in this capitalist way also leads us to see historical representation as a scarce resource we need to fight over, rather than something we can expand, reshape, and share. Instead, I want to propose that we use the language of community. In real life, we don't own or claim the members of our communities. We certainly don't forbid them to be members of multiple communities at once. Instead, we make space for them, We support, validate, and celebrate their presence in our community. We open our arms and shift things around to make them feel welcome. We're unlikely to share every aspect of our experience with every member of our community, but we have enough in common to create solidarity. We might find that we benefit from the support of different communities, even communities that might seem at odds to some. One person might feel at home among both trans men and lesbians, for example, or among both non-binary people and women. And if we keep our communities expansive and welcoming and continue to insist that they're not mutually exclusive, everybody's communities are richer. This is how, I hope, the histories in this book will enrich multiple present-day communities too. Expanding the scope of trans history doesn't mean erasing the history of others. With any story, but especially with stories this messy, emotional connection to the past isn't a zero-sum game. Like Suzanne Stryker, who points out that we can use trans as a verb as well as an adjective, I want to take the word trans back to its root, which reflect a sense of movement between places. Many, if not most, of the individuals whose stories I tell in this book can't be uncomplicatedly described as trans people. Whether that's because they've lived long before the term trans was coined, or because their experience of their gender was specific to a culture that doesn't or didn't use it, in which case the imposition of white, Western gendered paradigm would be an act of colonial violence. But the history in this book is trans history nonetheless. It shows us that it's history that shows us the movability of gender, It's history that shows us that, notwithstanding the outraged claims of anti-trans commentators today, what constitutes a man, a woman, or gender itself has continually been defined, contested, and redefined. It's the histories of people who've troubled the relationship between our bodies and how we live. People who've taken creative, critical approaches to gender binaries. People who've approached gender disruptively or messily. Before our current movement, before we were trans, these people showed us that gender was ours to play with, ours to challenge, ours to change. We don't know whether John Sullivan ever wore a gown again in England or Australia. We don't know what John felt while walking down the street, drunk on the night of Monday, the 8th of June, 1847. And we don't know whether "these clothes are mine" was an excuse for theft or something John genuinely felt. Perhaps John was female, or neither male nor female, for those minutes. Perhaps John was male, but expressing femininity. Perhaps John redefined masculinity to include wearing of dresses. Each one of those possibilities tells us a new story about the history of gender and provides us with the new promise about the way gender could be. Each of the stories in these pages that follow does the same. While I'm here, I'm going to read the author's note. Author's note, writing trans history differently. In writing this book, I was keen to do something different, to write a trans history that made space for complex and messy gendered experiences, and that had care and ethics at its heart, prioritizing the dignity and humanity of people in the past and the present. As a result, I've made a few decisions that set the book apart from many other histories like it, which I want to explain here. Pronouns. Most of the people in this book embody multiple gendered possibilities at once. We can interpret them simultaneously in several different ways. Because of this, I've chosen to use they/them pronouns to refer to the majority of the people in this book. In contemporary English, we use the pronoun they in 3 distinct senses. Many non-binary people use it as a deliberately claimed singular pronoun, pointedly emphasizing its neutrality. In many contexts, this is the pronoun that I choose for myself. But we also use it as a default singular pronoun for someone whose gender we don't know. And in this way, it can function as passively neutral as well as actively neutral. And of course, we use it as the plural pronoun to refer to more than one person. In this book, I'm partly using they in the second way, avoiding presumption of gender, rather than suggesting that the people I'm talking about would necessarily have actively chosen they-them pronouns, and partly in the third way, emphasizing the multiplicity and plurality of these people's genders. Choosing they-them as a neutral pronoun also allows me to avoid imposing gendered pronouns on people who wouldn't have used these in their native language. The exceptions, where I use he, him, she, her, or other pronouns, are people for whom we have evidence not just that they used these pronouns in life, which might, for many people, simply have indicated that they didn't have another option, but that they clearly articulated a male or female identity. Sources. My research for this book has gone beyond archival records of how people lived and into the literary world. The real people in this book rub shoulders with fictional characters, not because I think it's irrelevant whether trans historical figures existed or not, but because literature can often provide us with a fascinating glimpse into how people in a particular society thought about gender. Because queer fiction can sometimes provide new ways of thinking about possible trans pasts and futures that historians might never have thought of. One thing this book does is make visible the trans dimensions of other kinds of history: gay history, women's history, and the histories of costume and theater. In doing so, I engage with and cite many people who've gone before me. Some of these are fantastic, transforming scholars and activists whose work I hope this book lives up. Some others, though, are people who express transphobic and or racist views, and who I'm simply citing for the facts they provide. Anyone who wants to pursue further reading should approach these sources in the notes with this in mind. Finally, treating the past with respect. I've avoided giving the invasive details about trans and intersex people's bodies that populate many other histories. Nobody needs to know exactly what someone's genitals looked like to understand their story. I've also tried to minimize the number of times I refer to people as assigned male at birth, AMAP, or assigned female at birth, AFAB, partly because, as I mentioned above, these don't fully make sense for contexts without official birth registration, and partly because I'm concerned that these terms often get used to suggest that the gender of a trans person was assigned at birth is their real gender, or to separate non-binary people into another artificial binary. I haven't always been able to avoid these terms completely, though. The problem is that in many historical contexts, the gendered experiences that are available to people have depended on what their body was like, and how they were categorized socially on the basis of that body. But I've still tried to be mindful of this kind of categorization and the harmful impact it can have, and I'd encourage everyone who reads this book to be mindful of this too. Alright, my friends, that wraps up the introduction and the author's note of this book, Before We Were Trans by Gitaya. I am considering reading one chapter, one trans story, or Before We Were Trans story, several other books on it that I've read in their entirety or currently reading in their entirety. That is either because they are very old, such as Pride and Prejudice, or because I do not respect the author and I do not want you to give money to them. This does not fall into either one of those categories. Please support the author. Please support Gedaya. And please support other trans and non-binary authors as well. If I ever get my book published, I can be one of them. Alright, my friends. I hope you have a great afternoon, evening, morning,